A couple of years ago, I had a business trip in New York City. So I live in State College, Pennsylvania. I decided to drive to New Jersey, catch a train to Manhattan, and I'd come back the same way, which is what I did. I got my train ticket, drove to New Jersey to a train station, went up by train to Penn Station, had my business meeting, very successful, came back to the train station. That evening, I had a dinner at 6 p.m. My train got back at 5 p.m., plenty of time. So I went out to get into my car. I'm looking for my car. I got my luggage in hand. Can't find my car. I go around the parking lot. Can't find my car. Go all the way around the extended parking lot. Can't find it anywhere. So I do what I often do when I'm frustrated in these types of situations. I called my wife, Stephanie. She had a lot of words of wisdom. I had a lot of words of curses about why there's nobody there to help, no signage. In the end, neither her words of wisdom nor my curses served much use. So I continued to go around the parking lot. And maybe we all feel that way sometimes. We're trying to do something. There's no one there to help. There's no signage saying, go this direction, and we're stuck. So I continue on. Now darkness starts to set in. And at this point, I'm falling into just a bit of a panic because I realize that if it gets dark, it's going to be a lot harder to find this car. So I continue to go around. Darkness is starting to set in. Can't find anything. I finally found a bus driver, and he said, why don't you talk to someone in that car over there? It's a police car. I go over to the police car. There's nobody in the car. Still nobody there to help. No signs pointing the way. Keep going around in circles with my luggage in hand. It's getting darker. Now the dinner's starting to come closer to being late. Finally, I don't know, maybe after my 15th lap around the parking lot, a woman came over to me and said, is everything okay? And I said, I can't find my car. And she said, are you sure it's on this side of the tracks? And that was a key moment. I hadn't realized that there was parking on both sides of the track. So I found the bridge to go to the other side of the track, went over, found my car right away. That key insight of knowing that there were two sides to the track was all I needed to know. Maybe we all have that at times too. There's just one or two key insights that can help us launch forward, but we don't know what they are. So that's a key part of why I started Molecular Processes a few years ago, to have these moments when your organization is trying to advance in the acceleration front, you're trying to do things, trying to get faster speeds and higher value, but you're missing a key insight that can help you launch forward. And that's what Molecular Processes is all about. And so in this set of videos, I want to point out a few ideas and maybe a little inspiration on how molecular processes can help to accelerate your innovation processes. So let me show a few key parts here. First, what is this all about? What am I trying to do? First, I want to go through what is the problem that we have. And I think a key problem is that we're not focused on high growth rates, and sometimes inertia sets into our company. The way we've always done things is like this, and they're not ready to change. Second is, what is the promise? And I think there are two key parts here. One is the pride of your unit and the morale. Everybody's happy when we're advancing products and moving things through. We're less happy when things get stuck in red tape and stuck in committees and things like that, when things are not moving through, or when they recycle back to our organization over and over again. At the same time, I think the other part of the promise is great profits. And I'm looking at increases in profitability of your innovation team by 50% or maybe even more. And we'll take a look at how that might be possible. A third piece that we'll discuss is the philosophy. What is the philosophy of molecular processes? How do we make this work? And what we're going to see is a process manufacturing approach to innovation that opens up a whole literature to our disposal and ways of analysis. And one of the places where I'll be looking for answers is a book that perhaps you've read by Goldratt called The Goal. And he'll have a lot of insights into how we can open up our innovation processes to higher speed and higher value. Next, we'll look at the processes that you use for your innovation, and with a focus on flow. How do we get things to flow through? And especially, what are those pieces that are causing bottlenecks in your flow? What are the constraints on the flow that are slowing you down? And finally, we will take a look at some practices that we might start with, including the few daily disciplines, sometimes just a few daily disciplines. If we can get better by 1% per day or even 0.1% per day, over the course of a year, that's an extensive amount of gain. So we're going to look at those daily disciplines that can make the difference between going up exponentially or going down exponentially. And we'll look at what can we focus on Monday morning to get this to move through. So this is the agenda for our work. I'm going to erase this right-hand side, but keep the other words up. So we have these 5 pieces. First, maybe a bit of background about myself. I grew up in a small town called Colliers, West Virginia. Colliers for coal mining. It was formerly a coal town, then later became a steel town. And it was right near the city of Weirton, West Virginia, Weirton Steel. My dad was an engineer at Weirton Steel. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when I was very young, everything was steel. All your cans were steel. All your pieces of your car were steel. Your toilet paper was steel. Everything was steel. What could ever happen? Well, you fast forward to the late 1970s, and the parent company of Weirton Steel, National Steel, said that we're going to have some layoffs. And that was a dramatic change because it was just pure growth. There were 14,000 employees, just pure growth all the time. And that was the first hint that, wait, maybe something wasn't quite right. In the early 1980s, National Steel told Weirton Steel, we're going to shut this organization down. And at that point, Weirton Steel employees and the business leaders and the unions said to National Steel, can we buy the company? Which they did. They bought the company. To do that, my dad had to take a 1/3 pay cut. This was at the time when my oldest brother and my sister were going off to college. And so at this time, when you most needed funds, my dad was taking a 1/3 pay cut. Weirton Steel was in deep trouble at that point. They had a few good years after that, which people worked hard and things went well. But a decade later, Weirton Steel was essentially out of business, and now the company is long bankrupt. So this is my view of what happens when you're not innovating. Weirton Steel did have a research and development unit. They weren't producing enough innovations to keep that company alive. I can remember them laughing at a small startup company called Nucor when they were a nothing company working with low grade and low value steel. They just kept using the Clayton Christensen idea of disruptive innovation to move right up the chain. Now they're the largest in the United States. So what could ever happen to Weirton Steel? It's out of business. You fast forward a few years, and I'm a professor at Penn State University studying colloidal systems. And I'm at a meeting one day, and I realize that my mind is not advancing as rapidly as I wanted to. I'd sort of plateaued in what I'm learning in the colloidal systems area. It's at the top of the field, but the rate of growth was very slow, and that was worrisome. So in 2013, I co-taught a MOOC, a massive open online course with Jack Madsen and Catherine Yabuklov, and the course was on creativity, innovation, and change. I came to see what some of the challenges were, why some of the things had stagnated, which led to, in 2017, my starting the Molecular Processes Company in order to advance research faster and at higher value. So that's the story. Now, back to the problem. We're looking at growth, and if you back up to 1979, and you look at the companies on the Dow Jones 30, there were 23 of them. about 3/4 of the Dow Jones 30 was related to the chemical industry or the materials industry. And if you fast forward about 40 years to 2018, only about a fourth of them, about 8, are still on that Dow Jones 30. You still have Procter & Gamble on it. You still have Coca-Cola on it. You still have a few other people, ExxonMobil, but many of them, like Union Carbide and Texaco and some of the others, either don't exist anymore or have fallen off of the Dow 30. So there's been a dramatic shift in the Dow 30. And who has joined now the Dow 30? You have a lot of banks, you have service companies, you have Apple is on that Dow 30, Walmart, Walt Disney. So you've had a dramatic change in the Dow 30 over the last 40 years. Another plot that I find striking is to look at the internal rate of return as a function of the year for the pharma industry. Now, this is work from Boston Consulting Group and Deloitte. And what they found was if you back up to around the year 1995, the internal rate of return was about 25% on the R&D. So this is pharma R&D. It was about 25%. The cost of capital for this industry, let's say, is around 7%. If you look out over the years, and this is now 2020, what you find is that there is a steady progression that has left us now at about 2%. And by this time, it's possible that it's even 0%. A dramatic drop in the internal rate of return of these pharmaceutical companies. And maybe you've seen this drop in your company, a dramatic loss in productivity and throughput that is causing this rate of return to go down. And it dropped below the cost of capital around the year 2010. So these are part of the problem that we've seen in the chemical process industries, and it's all across the industry. The growth rate of the entire industry is on the order of 3 to 4%, and it's projected to stay there for years to come, even the decades to come. And so this is a real challenge in terms of gaining investment and gaining talent from students. So now let's take a look at what is the promise. So I'll erase this at this point. We've now looked at the problem: low growth, high inertia, companies not wanting to change what they're doing, continuing on and hoping things are going to be different. But now we're going to look at what is the promise. And I want to point out this outstanding book by Eliyahu Goldratt called The Goal. And this plot I'm pulling from reading his book. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the profitability, the marginal profitability, that is to say, as a function of what he calls the throughput, which is the number sold. This is an important point. In his book, he makes a significant point out of the fact that it's not how much you put in inventory, it's not how much supply you have, it's how many go to the store and are sold, because that's what's putting cash in your company's coffers. So we're going to look the same way with innovation. We're going to look at throughput in terms of dollars per year. And let's say that this is the zero line. When you first start out, as your productivity is very low, you have losses. These are all losses, and these are due to fixed costs. Somebody has to pay for the lights, somebody has to pay for the parking lot, you have perhaps a library, you have your research campus or your research office, you have laboratory equipment, your employees, which are hard to replace very quickly. So you have all these fixed costs. And so if your throughput is too low, your fixed costs totally eat you up. At some point, your marginal profitability, it exceeds zero. However, you have to make up for all these fixed cost losses. And so this is what we call the break-even point. You need at least this much research in order to break even, for your R&D team to break even. Now, there are a couple interesting points here. One is, if you go above this break-even point, this curve keeps going like this. The next unit you sell has the highest marginal profit. So this, because your fixed costs are already diluted out, your marginal profits continue to go up. And so at this point, we have our profit from our innovation team. And you can see that it's just a fraction of the sales that are putting this here. So if we're a little bit below, we have net loss. If we're a little bit above, we have net profit. And one of the magical things that Goldratt talks about is getting away from a cost accounting mindset and into a throughput mindset. And why does he say that? You can never make money by simply reducing costs. You have to have throughput in order to make money. And his point is, if I can nudge this throughput up just a little bit, I can double my innovation profits. So to double my innovation profits, I don't need to double my throughput. I just need to nudge them up a little bit. This is such a key insight. And it's going to be a key feature of what we're going to look at. So if I say, what's a simple equation to look at the profitability of an innovation process? I can say that the profitability is a sum from 1 to n projects. See, this n is all the projects in your portfolio of the revenue of that project, the anticipated revenue of that project, times the anticipated margin, profit margin of that product, times the probability of success of that project, probability of success due to all sorts of risks, due to marketing risks, due to changes of the world risks, due to technical things that can't be overcome. There are all sorts of risks that go into this probability, divided by the time required to go from the conception of the idea to the launch of the final product. This one is frequently ignored in many R&D teams. They say, well, let's just keep working on it until we get it right. But you need that certain throughput rate in order to have a profitable innovation center. So you have 5 variables here. You have the portfolio, the end projects in your portfolio that you can adjust, the revenue, the margin, the probability of success, and the time. And each of these is a lever that we can control in order to increase the innovation profitability of your team. Now, another key point here is that if we can just nudge, this gets back to Goldratt's comment, if we can nudge by 10% each of these, so if we can increase your revenue, perhaps by expanding your market by 10%, if we can increase your profit margin, perhaps by increasing the value of the products by 10%, if we can increase the probability of success, perhaps by getting the correct questions sooner and so we can answer them sooner, and if we can decrease the time by 10% through a number of methods, then we can increase the profits by 1.1 to the 4th power equals 1.46. So that means that the change is plus 46% in the profitability simply by nudging each of these 10%. To me, that's amazing. Small nudges make a big difference. And so the question, of course, is how do we nudge it? And that's what I want to get into in much of the rest of what I have to say. I do want to show one example first. And that is, this is related to a project that I did with one client. If we have a pie that has a $40 million a year anticipated revenue, and we have a 30%, that we expect the profit margin to be 30%. Let's say it's early in the project, we expect a 40% probability of success, and we expect it to take 5 years. Then this says that the profit margin, the profit from this acceleration, and I use the word acceleration because revenue is dollars per year, and I'm dividing by time, so that's dollars per year. It's how much I'm enhancing my yearly revenue, so it's an acceleration. If I can do this, then the profit margin is 0.96 million dollars per year, or per year squared. Now, if I can increase to the betterment each of these by 10%, so if I can take this to $44 million, if I can take the profit margin to 33%, if I can change the probability of success to 44%, and if I can drop the time by half a year, 1/10 of 5 years, I now increase my profitability to $1.42 million per year squared. It's a dramatic change in profitability. Again, 46%. So these are the types of numbers that we can start to deal with. And this one, which is 5 years, often has capacity for even more. We can sometimes change that one even more dramatically and take some things that are even in your existing pipeline and have been there for 10 years, 15 years. I've heard of cases where companies lose their patent rights because something's still in the pipeline. They still haven't gotten it through regulatory or toxicology or something. And so we can perhaps take, for some of your longer projects, it's from 5 things that are projected now to be 8 years, sometimes even down to 4 years or even 3 years. That's a dramatic change in the innovation profitability. Okay. So how do we adjust? What can we do? I'm going to erase all this now. So we've looked at the problem, low growth and high inertia. We've looked at the promise, the possibility of increasing our innovation throughput by 50%, our profitability. Next, we want to look at what is the philosophy. So what are the pieces of the philosophy? There are all sorts of books on this, of course. There are hundreds of books, and we've read many of them, right? We have the great book by Jim Collins. We have books by Jack Welch. We have the book by Eliyahu Goldratt. We have Traction by Wickman. We have hundreds of these sorts of books, and each of them has a little bit different angle. And the question starts to become, which book do I listen to? And the philosophy that I want to show next looks at all of these in a somewhat coherent way. First, what is the common way right now that we do innovation? We do stage gate. Every company uses stage gate in one form or another. There are a few challenges with it. So the idea is that we start with the R&D team. We have a gate. They throw it over the wall. And who picks it up next? Maybe legal. Legal throws it over the wall. Who picks it up next? Maybe regulatory. They throw it over the wall. Who picks it up next? Manufacturing. Throw it over the wall. Maybe marketing. These orders might change. And there might be some mixing among these. But stage gate has a few inherent challenges. Number one, it's inherently serial. Even though it doesn't necessarily have to be, it almost always is. And so these start to become silos. There are a couple problems with that. One is that these silos are slow. An even worse problem of the serial nature, however, is that it assumes that all information that was needed was known in a previous stage. So manufacturing is assuming that regulatory knew everything they needed when they looked at it, and regulatory is assuming that legal knew everything they needed when they looked at it, and legal is assuming R&D knew everything they needed when they looked at it. It's very seldom true. And so what ends up happening many times is you get down to the regulatory or manufacturing stage, and you find out that, wait, R&D didn't know about that, and so you have to throw it all the way back to the beginning, across silos. There are other problems with these. One is the silos are often not well prioritized. It's who can make it to the gate first. And so rather than strategically looking over the entire portfolio of the projects, we say, well, who's next? And we bring them in, beat them up, put them through the gate perhaps even. But the inherent prioritization is not it's not prioritized, not strategized across all pieces. So that can be a real problem. Third, the stage gate process is inherently evaluative. It evaluates every step along the way. It's not generative or creative. These are things that seldom appear. The legal team seldom adds anything to what the R&D team is doing. The manufacturing team seldom adds anything to what the R&D team is doing. But if all these were integrated, then manufacturing could speak directly to R&D and say, that's going to be a very difficult material to process. So that's a really challenging way to build that or to make that. Marketing could say, well, I'm not sure that's going to be valuable for the customer. Regulatory could say, hey, that material's been banned in Europe for a couple of years now, or will be soon, maybe in a couple of years. So those are generative pieces when they can crosstalk amongst each other. Right now, it's primarily evaluative. And the fourth thing is stage gate is inherently inventorial, meaning that things go through this process. Very frequently, they have to come back to the beginning. And so you have research that has been done, you have legal work that has been done, but it's sitting in inventory. It's not leading directly to an innovation that can be sold. And so this inventory or recycle starts to grow. And it's expensive because it's stuff you spent money on, but you're not gaining any return on it. And that's a real problem. So we'd like to be able to overcome these. And the first thing is, so I'll erase the stage gate piece. The first thing is to recognize that what are we actually trying to innovate? What are the pieces we need to build? We oftentimes think, well, find out what the customer wants and then you just make it. But I think we have to be a little more discerning on this. We have to be a little more precise on what it is that we're trying to manufacture here. And one of the first things that I think we need to figure out is, what is the future voice of the customer? How many times I've spoken with representatives and they've said, well, of course we start with the customer. We find out what they want and we make it. But we're not necessarily interested just in the voice of the customer, because in many cases, they don't even know what they want, or more especially, what they need. What we want is a future voice of the customer. We want to know what they will need 3 years from now or 5 years from now. And we have to iterate toward that. We can't simply, nobody hands you a brief and says, hey, here's what they're going to want in 7 years. It doesn't exist. So we need to build that future voice of the customer. The second thing we're going to need is an integrated innovation team. This is what we talked about with the stage gate. It's not enough to have all these silos that go through one at a time. We need the integrated innovation team where all these people are together simultaneously, including the sustainability people, including the VP leaders, including the finance people. All of them need to be together so that the ideas can flow back and forth and there could be one surge for this product moving out. And then finally, we need the ideas that are going to push this through. And by the ideas, it's not just the new ideas. We need to know what are the valuable questions that have to be answered in order to get to that future voice of the customer. We need to know what are the barriers. We need to know what are the multiple hypotheses for the questions. And this is where a lot of the creative work happens. Asking the right questions and posing multiple hypotheses that can be determined rapidly. The testing can determine whether something's incorrect rapidly. This is a major gain in speed in the research process, if we can do this. And this just loops around. So we hypothesize a future voice of the customer. The integrated innovation team examines it from a number of perspectives, comes up with a number of reasons, questions that pose risks, that identify risks, hypotheses for what to answer those questions. We test it, and we update the future voice of the customer based on this. Maybe there's some things we found out, hey, we can actually do this, and it enhances this. Or maybe some feature that we didn't realize that would be so difficult, we say, well, is that really that valuable? We just keep going around. As you change the future voice of the customer, you might need to add or subtract somebody from your team who might, again, change what questions you ask or what hypotheses you pose. So this triangle is how we're going to manufacture innovation. And again, we need enough throughput here, so we have to be able to do this fast enough so that we can keep going. So the next piece is, this is the process manufacturing of innovation. How are we going to do this? What are the pieces that go into process manufacturing? So I'm going to erase this now, but we'll keep these in mind: the future voice of the customer, the integrated innovation team, the questions, the hypotheses. So the next thing is to look at a process. Now, in Chemical Engineering 101, which I taught at Penn State, it's called Chemical Engineering 210, which I've taught many, many times to the intro class. We say we have a reactor. So we have some fresh input into this reactor. We say it goes to a separator. Part of this goes out to the customer. Part of it we recycle because all of the ideas that went into here, all the fresh materials didn't react. And so we don't want to waste those, so we bring those back. So we have a recycle. And somewhere in here we have a purge. Over it all, we have process control. This is the same process that I see innovation working at. First, we want to identify this piece, or at least hypothesize it, the future voice of the customer. And we need to figure out what input do we need in order to get there. So we're going to need certain concepts. We're going to need certain ideas. We're going to need certain experts, maybe external to the company even at first. They come into the reactor. Now, the reactor is a generative unit. That's where the transformations take place that produce valuable products. Here is where I see the valuable questions and the multiple hypotheses forming. I think they're the hardest part of research, is coming up with good questions and hypotheses. It's where I struggle with my PhD students the most to get those moving through. And even when we're working with companies, it's where I see them struggling the most to define clear questions and pose multiple hypotheses. This now goes to the evaluative unit, which is where separations occurs. This is where you do your laboratory tests. This is where you do your pilot tests. This is where you go to your customer to try out some different marketing, some ideas in the marketplace and see how valuable they'll be, see if they'll do pre-orders. And this is where you go to evaluate each step along the way. Those pieces that go through to the customer, to the future voice of the customer, go there. The recycle comes back. So there's some ideas we say, well, we're going to need a little more work on those, and they come back. Any ideas that we don't see, even if we've invested a lot of money in it, if we have ideas that don't look like they're going to be the best we have, we should purge those. They're inert. We purge the inerts out of the system and the toxins so that they don't build up and destroy the whole process. These come back to the beginning and they go back into the generative unit. So this is how Chemical Engineering 101 works. This is a well-functioning innovation process. What happens many times? Well, if here we have stage gate who in practice or even by threat of action acts as a tight valve here. This recycle starts to get thicker. And this, remember, recycle is like inventory. It's what you paid for, but you're not receiving any profitability from it. You're not selling anything from it. So this recycle starts to get thicker. The purge sometimes ends up over here at the customer level. This is the worst place for us to end up, of course, because what that means is that the customer is purging it. And not only has your product failed, but your brand has failed, and it detracts from the value of your brand as well. So the purge can sometimes end up in the wrong place. The recycle has gotten thicker, and now, because your capacity, unless you're hiring a lot more people, which you don't often see, your capacity of your generative and your evaluative steps has not changed. It's now filled up with recycle. And this fresh input, starts to get cut off, and it becomes a very thin loop. In fact, negligible in some cases. Very few companies have a deliberate program of their innovation team taking courses and attending conferences, bringing back ideas, not just going to the conference, but bringing back ideas, bringing in experts systematically. The systematic and deliberate input. The systematic and deliberate input starts to die. And that means you're left with the ideas you started with. So the reactor now is consumed by this recycle. It goes over to here, and this loop, this unit operation, this evaluation starts to get thicker and thicker and thicker, because we start to spend more time in the laboratory. There's no new ideas coming in, so there's nothing to generate now. So we spend more time in the laboratory, as if that extra time in the laboratory is what's responsible for adding value for the customer. The primary purpose of research and development is not to spend time in the laboratory. It's to advance innovations for that future voice of the customer. That's such a key point. Our job is not lab experiments, but to test ideas and to get rid of them, to get rid of the losers. So as this gets not only thicker, but I'll put some marks in it like this, it becomes incomplete. Incomplete because frequently this evaluative step, as we discussed earlier, is just from one perspective. It might be just from the marketing team's perspective, or just from the R&D team's perspective, rather than holistically, because the whole chain is required to get an innovation out the door. So this is both, it gets both thicker and incomplete, and you can see the whole thing is getting distorted. The whole thing is getting distorted. And that's where Goldrot's bottlenecks start to come in. Now, we can look at a number of bottlenecks, but I want to just focus on a few. I want to focus on this stage gate and recycle as one. I want to focus on the integrated innovation team as two. I want to focus on the valuable questions as three, and the deliberate input as four. There are many others that we could look at here, but those are the first that I want to look at. So the first is this stage gate one, which we've already discussed it in some ways. We've discussed how as this acts as a valve, the stage gate process, not only is it siloed, not only is it primarily evaluative, but it's serial, it's slow, and it really kills morale. People are not only does this act as a valve when products reach the stage gate and are rejected, but the threat of that happening can be also be hurtful. In one case, I was working with a client, and they were talking about doing work, and the legal department had told them that they had enough examples for their patent, but the researcher kept going, kept running experiments. He said, I think we need a few more experiments. And I can appreciate that perspective. As scientists, we're oftentimes dedicated to getting things right, but having this integrated innovation team says, hey, let's listen to the IP person. When they say we have enough examples, let's move on to the next test, because there are many more valuable things we have to get to in order to move innovations out the door. So this stage gate is a real challenge. Second is forming this this integrated innovation team. How do we do that? Who does that? Well, who does it could start with anybody, really, and it could be somebody from marketing. I find that R&D is a good place to start in many cases, just because the people in R&D seem to have an easier time understanding some other ideas, and sometimes people do understanding R&D ideas, and so that's a nice place to start. But it doesn't have to be a VP to do this. It can be anyone on the team who starts to gather people and say, hey, let's look at some ideas, start over lunch. Take a look at these ideas. And they start to pull things together. Next thing you know, they're talking to multiple people. And next thing you know, you have a team that includes somebody from legal, somebody from regulatory, somebody from various categories, so that they can start to push things forward. Now, one of the challenges here is who gets the credit. And this is one place where leadership can play a big role. If leadership is willing to say, hey, let's spread the credit appropriately, but there are other methods for doing this. Spreading the credit is who owns it, in other words, can be a real challenge. So this is the second one, this integrated innovation team. The third thing is with the questions, which we'll get to in a little bit, and also the concepts, the new concepts, which we'll get to in a little bit. So I said we would go through, look at the philosophy, which is process manufacturing, look at the processes, which in this case is a standard chemical engineering flow diagram, a process flow diagram. Finally, now we're at the practices. And so this is the last piece. So we're on this final piece now. We have this idea. We have this triangle in the middle. We need to manufacture the future voice of the customer. We need to manufacture the integrated innovation team. We need to manufacture the ideas, the valuable questions, and the multiple hypotheses. Who does this? Well, we're going to have R&D doing it. We're going to have legal doing it. We're going to have regulatory, sometimes toxicology doing it. We're going to have manufacturing contributing to it. We're going to have marketing contributing to it. We're going to have VP levels, hopefully, in the meeting. No reason not to, doing it. We might have people from finance, might have sustainability, might have a number of other pieces of your organization. Everybody who's in the chain of innovation needs to be in this meeting at the beginning. If you have one or two people from each of these, you can go a long way. Your innovation team should not and cannot start as simply having 6 people from R&D in the room. You're not going to get very fast movement. You need to start connecting with marketing and with the leadership and with manufacturing. How are you going to make it as soon as when you're ready? Make sure you can get it through regulatory, and so it doesn't get stuck in that pipeline. Make sure your legal people are on board. Not only can they make sure that your ideas are not infringing upon others, but they can frequently add ideas that you didn't expect because they've seen such a broad variety of ideas. So this integrated innovation team is really important to start with. It's one of the things that we've done a number of times in molecular. We've brought people together from multiple continents, both in person and by video call. Done this on a number of occasions, and it's been extremely helpful because many of the people we have worked with are international. You can't even get everybody in the same spot if you wanted to. If you're all in the same location, you have some shot at that, but even then, it's helpful if you can pull together people from various categories and functions, some of them remotely. And it's nice to have a facilitator for this. This is one of the things that we do at Molecular, is to facilitate these conversations by knowing enough about each of these and some questions and knowing how to facilitate the conversations. we can help to build the trust and the vulnerability among this team so that they start to talk to each other and collaborate. So that's the integrated innovation team. That's the first thing to build when you're trying to advance your innovation quickly. Okay. Next are some catalyst questions. So the questions I see to be like catalysts for movement. I want to just draw this little chart. So this is an exercise we do. If we look at some of the various functions, and I'm not going to list them all here, but I'll list a few. If we list the R&D function, if we list the marketing function, if we list the legal function, if we list the manufacturing function, and we take some data on how valuable do you think this product is going to be. Now that can be a fairly vague question to start with, but we put a few guidelines on it. And what we want to know is what I call their 20, 50, 80. It will be more valuable than X dollars 20% of the time, more valuable 50% of the time, so that's the median, or more valuable 80% of the time. So you get a distribution from each of the people there. And what you find is this. If you say that this is 1 million, 10 million, and 100 million, you often will find something like this. You'll find that the R&D people say, okay, we think it's going to have a mode somewhere around maybe 20 million, but it's going to have this distribution. The marketing people might be very excited about it, and they might say, no, this has immense possibility. We might have a broader spread, but we think it's going to be closer to a $100 million project. Legal might say, you know, we've seen this sort of thing before a bit, and so we're putting it down closer to 1 million. And manufacturing says that's an easy one to manufacture. The cost will be low, and so this will be somewhere closer to 10 million. Okay, and each of these has variance in it. Now I know that companies have ways of estimating the value of their potential innovations. They're almost always wrong. There's a great book I read called Loon Shots, and it was talking about one CEO when he started. He asked his team to compare the projected value of their recent innovations with their actual value for 20 cases. And he asked the question in the book, how many were within a factor of 2? And the answer was 0. That's been my experience as well, is that estimates for these tend to be almost guesses for the valuation of anticipated research. So you have these pieces, and they're all over the map, from 10 up to 100, down to 1. So this is the place where you start to get to valuable questions. You say, okay, legal, what risks do you see? And therefore, what questions do you want to ask so that you are more aligned? Now, that doesn't mean there's only one correct value, but what we're trying to do is to get each of these so that maybe they're a little closer together. They might not be exactly aligned, but we want them to be somewhat aligned together instead of all over the map. We want to know what questions does each function need to see asked and tested in order to get those alignments. So sometimes I think of this as portfolio alignment. And the alignment is actually more important, I think, than the straight valuation of the product. Okay, so this is a method this is a modified Delphi method described in several, many literature articles, described well in the book by Scrum by Sutherland. The idea is we're trying to get people on the same page who might not be starting on the same page. Now, the next thing is we have the questions now. This next one is so important for speed and innovation, and that is having multiple hypotheses or multiple solutions in mind for what the answer might be. It's one thing just to explore randomly. It's another thing to say, you know, I've thought about it for a while, and I think A, B, C, or D are the likely answers. So now you can test those very quickly instead of just exploring all over the place, which can be very slow. Diffusive exploration is very slow. Convective exploration is much more quick. So MHs. There's a great paper by Platt. He calls it strong inference, but really what he's talking about is having the scientific method on steroids. And it's basically this, having multiple hypotheses where you put hypothesis A, B, C, D up there, and someone does a test and they say, it can't be B, B's not viable, or B's not effective. And so now you need to spend more time thinking and come up with possibility E. And then you say, D's not as good either. D's not enough, not sufficient for us. We need to do something different. And A is not sufficient either. We need to come up with something different. And coming up with these new alternatives, this is where the essence of the hard work comes in. This is and to not come up with these is, in my mind, a failure of imagination. Part of that failure comes in the last part, and that is when we look at the fresh input. Where can you gain input so that you can learn things about these? Many research facilities have nice rooms or nice campuses even, in which their employees can go out, sit near a lake, sit near a water fountain, read and learn, but they're very seldom used. Every time I go around, all these beautiful grounds are empty and people are in their laboratory. What can you do while you're out in these beautiful areas? One is you can read new books. It doesn't have to even be a new book. It could be an old book, but if it's new to you, it's a fresh idea into your innovation process. Journals. You might have a particular journal article that someone might recommend. So books and journals, spending some time reading these, studying these. Courses. You say, well, I'm a professional researcher. I don't need to be taking courses. Well, maybe you do. Maybe you do need to take those courses in order to learn the latest about something in machine learning. And if you're somebody in regulatory, maybe you need to learn about certain safety practices. If you're somebody in marketing, maybe you do need to learn about machine learning. If you're somebody in R&D, maybe you need to learn about financial statements and so on. So these courses, including massive open online courses, which are frequently free online. They're usually very well done. There's frequently hundreds of thousands of dollars that go into preparing each course, and they're frequently very well done in a huge variety of subjects. So if you type in accounting MOOC into Google, it'll come up with a number of MOOCs from which you can select and choose which one you think will be the best. The American Institute of Chemical Engineers has a number of courses, including in safety and process intensification, which might be a very important area for you. So all of these ideas can go into reducing this failure of imagination so that you can come up with more hypotheses, which then you can, again, test much more rapidly than simply going to the lab and trying an experiment. Okay? There is a time to play in the laboratory. That's a very important time. And that's when you're coming up with new ideas. Maybe you've just launched something and you say, okay, that project is now completed. We can come back and we can take some, a few weeks to start, or even a few months to study something new and to play around and to try things. That time I think is very important. But once you have in your mind the idea that something's going to go, it's time to go. I'll show one more plot on what I call vectorization. Many companies, if this is a start, if this is the idea conception, if this is the launch to the customer, many companies have the idea that, okay, we're going to work on these, we have this many people on our team, we're going to work on these 5 projects at once. And these might not even be competitive projects, meaning they might require totally different resources, different people, different equipment in the laboratory, but they might overlap a bit. Sometimes the same person might be able to work on 3 different projects, or analytical might be able to only serve 2 out of 5 more quickly. So you have all these different projects, and we say, okay, we're going to continue on quarter after quarter. And at this quarter, we'll be able to launch these products. And this is a suboptimal way to move things forward. How much better it would be if these are, again, if they are competing in any way, say we have this, the end line is here. If we can put all our eggs in one basket and go for it, or 2 baskets, and drive something to the finish line or eliminate it more quickly, this guy can now start to produce profits, which can feed the next unit. The quicker you can drive things all the way to the finish line, the less time you spend in between at each step. It's a well-known way to increase your innovation speed, is to take things all the way to the finish line as rapidly as you can, doing one thing at a time, or killing it. You might get this one this far, and you say, this is an insurmountable barrier. At least you know to kill it. You don't continue to work on it. So that's what I call vectorization. So these are some of the practices that we can do in order to speed up innovation. And that covers what I wanted to cover today. The problem, which again is low growth rates, high inertia in companies. The promise, if we can nudge things just a little bit, nudge the margins, nudge the time, our profitability can increase dramatically. The philosophy, one of process manufacturing, thinking about inputs, thinking about outputs, focusing on the future voice of the customer, the integrated innovation team, and the ideas, which are start with the questions and hypotheses. The processes, and especially the bottlenecks that can arise, stage gate being a primary one, but there are others as well, including having fresh ideas, including not having clear, valuable questions, including some project management ideas that I did not discuss today. And finally, these practices that I close with. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I thank you for listening. I look forward to talking with you soon. Hopefully, molecular processes can add value to your innovation processes, increasing the speed, increasing the value for your clients. And I look forward to working with you soon. Thank you.